All right, good evening. I'm going to try and give a quick Chazarah on Menachos Daf Lamed. The goal here is to present the key takeaways of the Daf to somebody who listened to a Daf Yomi shiur and perhaps wants a higher level takeaway of what were the main points here. Let's get into it. So Menachos Daf Lamed, there are four main topics here. The first one is the final 8 psukim of the Torah, discussing who wrote them. They describe Moshe's death. Did Moshe write them? The next one is some halachos regarding a Sefer Torah, the white space between letters, words, and columns, etc. Then we discussed if you skipped Hashem's name and moved on to the next word, how can you recover? How can you fix that Sefer Torah? And then we discussed Ravin saying the halach is like Rabbi Shimon Chazuri. What case was he referring to? Let's get into it. The final 8 psukim in the Torah, who wrote them? So we have a machlokas here between Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Nehemiah and Rabbi Shimon. Now, Rabbi Yehuda comes and says it's Yoshua, whereas Rabbi Shimon comes and says, well, the final 8 psukim Hashem dictated and Moshe wrote them with tears. He did not verbalize them back to Hashem, unlike the rest of the Torah where Moshe listened to Hashem, repeated back, and transcribed. What's the motivation of each side? So Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, very simple. The psukim describe Moshe's death. Why would Moshe be writing these psukim? Rabbi Shimon says in response, but hang on, we know that Moshe placed a complete Sefer Torah in the Aron. It must have included these psukim, so he wrote about his death before he actually died. Now, Rav in the Gemara said, you cannot break up these final 8 psukim into multiple aliyot. You have to read it in one aliyah. So the Gemara suggested it makes sense that Rav is consistent with the first opinion, with Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah, but on the surface, it looks like he's inconsistent with Rabbi Shimon. But then the Gemara concluded this is actually not the case. We can say that Rav says we want to keep them in one aliyah, i.e. they are one entity that doesn't make sense to break up. Why? Even though Moshe wrote the whole Torah, these 8 psukim are unique from the rest of the Torah because he wrote them while crying and did not repeat them back to Hashem, and therefore they're different, so we read them as one unit. That is the sugya of the final 8 psukim. Then we moved on to discuss Hilchos Sefer Torah. The first thing the Gemara pointed out was buying a Sefer Torah. You shouldn't buy it from the market. That's like grabbing a mitzvah, and that's a criticism. Rather, you shall write it yourself. Then the Gemara points out what we are familiar with as a minhag. You can fix even one letter of the Sefer Torah, and it's as though you fulfilled the ideal mitzvah. Then we discussed how many columns should you have on each parchment of the Torah. And here, if there are 2 columns, that looks too ugly because there's stitches on both sides. Too much stitches, not the greatest. On the other extreme, if we have 9 columns and the parchment's too wide, that's too few stitches, the Torah may tear. The ideal is somewhere between 3 to 8 columns, and then we get the best of both worlds, aesthetic, but not too many stitches. Then we discussed, okay, let's say you have a very wide parchment, and you could put 9 columns on it. So the Gemara said, don't break this up into 3 and 6. You can't keep it as 9, that's too many. Rather, break it up into 4 and 5. It's more aesthetic to keep the parchments roughly the same width. We then moved to column width and readability. So the Gemara pointed out, you can't have the column to be too narrow. I just had an example here. If there's only one word on the column, it's not okay. It looks like a letter, and we don't want to have a letter here, we want to have a Torah. There is an exception, the Gemara points out. The final column of the whole Torah can be written on its own parchment and even have one word per row because it's the final column of the Torah, and that things may work out that way. But we're talking about the rest of the Torah. Likewise, you don't want to have a too wide column. If it's too wide, as we know ourselves, you get lost in the middle of the row. It's too confusing. Your eyes wander while reading. The ideal is what the Gemara describes as having Lemishpechotechem written 3 times on each row. So a decently sized row with a few words. You can read it. See our Sefer Torah for what's reasonable. We then discussed the white margins around the Sefer Torah and also around Chumashim. You have to remember in those days they didn't have books. They would handwrite individual Sfarim of the Torah. So for a Torah, we pointed out The bottom, you want to have a whole tefach of white space. Why? You might be holding it and you don't want to ruin the letters. Between two columns, you can have 2 fingers worth, and at the top, you can have 3 fingers worth. For a chumash, it can be narrower margins, 2 etzbas at the top, 1 thumb's worth between the columns, and 3 fingers at the bottom. We then discussed the margins between words and letters. So, firstly, between words, you should have the space of a small letter. So I have here a yud. Between rows, we don't pascha like this, but the Gemara pointed out, you should have space equal to the height of a row. And between each letter within a word, you shall have kechud hasa'ara, a hair's breadth between each letter. We then discussed shrinking text to create space based on the margins that you have around each column. So it's problematic to keep the bottom row or the top row very, very small because you want to try and get that space at the bottom or top, because it looks unaesthetic if suddenly you have a smaller font in the final row. Likewise, if you want to try and get a space between different rows, you shouldn't have a middle row that's too small. It also looks unaesthetic there. And when you have parshiot stumot, you have a paragraph ends on one row and a new one starts on that same row, you need to have a gap of 9 letters between those 2 parashiot. If you want to achieve that gap by writing small font later on in the row, as this example I have in front of us, that's also not okay. You don't want to shrink text to achieve these goals. Then we discussed the rules about the end of the line. We know that ideally you need to make sure that the text reaches all the way till the end of the line. So let's say you're writing a Torah, you get to the end of the line and you have a 5-letter word. I have here an example, Vayomer. Now, you see, you're not going to be able to fit the whole word at the end of the line. But what you do is you write 3 letters that take you to the end of the column and 2 letters that protrude outside of the column. It's not ideal that you're outside the column, but it's the best solution here. You can't go and write on the next line and have that white space, as I show you in the second example here. That white space is very problematic. It's better to write and go 2 letters over the column. Likewise, you can't go 2 letters inside the column and 3 letters outside. The majority of the word needs to be inside the column. This is the case with a 5-letter word. The Gemara then discussed a 2-letter word. By a 2-letter word, even though we said by the 5-letter word 2 letters can be outside the column, by a 2-letter word, since 2 letters outside the column would be the full word, what you should do is start that 2-letter word on a new line rather than putting it outside the column. Very good. This is the sugya of Hilchos Sefer Torah. We then moved to the case where the Sofer was writing a Torah and then he skipped Hashem's name. He wrote the next word already and realized, oh, I did not write Hashem's name. What do I do now? And we had a 5-way machlokes Tanaim. Rabbi Yehuda came and said, wait for the ink to dry. Once the ink dries, you can then scrape it off the incorrect word and write Hashem's name on top of that. And then the word you scraped off, you can insert on top. Everything's good. Rabbi Yossi came and said, hang Hashem's name. What does this mean? You put Hashem's name between those 2 lines, and it's okay that is hanging. Rabbi Yitzchak came and said, you don't need to wait for the ink to dry to scrape off the incorrect word. Rather, you can even wipe off the incorrect word while it's still wet. And even though there's a smudge that's remaining, he holds that it's okay. Now, Rabbi Shimon Shizuri says, qualifying what Rabbi Yossi said earlier, when you hang Hashem's name, you have to make sure that his full name is hanging, not that some of the name is in the line and some is hanging, rather the full name is hanging. And then Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar had the most stringent opinion. He said there's no way to save this Sefer Torah. You cannot write Hashem's name on the erased part. You can't hang Hashem's name. You have to throw out that sheet, it must be buried, and start that yiriyah, that parchment again. Now, the Gemara then pointed out there's machlokes between Rav Chananel quoting Rav and Rabbi Baruchana quoting Shmuel, whether the halacha is like what Rabbi Yossi said or Rabbi Yitzchak said. The Gemara pointed out they did not say halacha like each Tana because they're different versions of what the Tanaim said. Now, so that was the machlokes amoraim. Then we came and had a very cryptic statement of Ravin quoting Rabbi Ula, quoting Rabbi Chanina, and he came and said the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, and not only that, any place Rabbi Shimon Shizuri taught, halacha is like him. And we bring up the sugya because we're not sure what is this extra place of any place that he taught. Halacha is also like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, and we think it's our sugya. Now, the Gemara then struggles now, and it goes into tomorrow's stuff, about what exactly was Ravin referring to here when he said we paskin like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri in certain cases. And as a pattern that we go through, we have 7 attempts, 5 attempts today and 2 tomorrow that succeed. But the 5 attempts that we had today are rejected because the Gemara has a pattern where it says, well, if this is what Ravin meant, he should have been quoted when other Amoraim quoted Rabbi Shimon Shizuri's halacha over in that case. So let's go through those 5 cases that are rejected. The 2 cases that are accepted we have in tomorrow's Chazarah. So case number 1 was the case of the Sofer, which is what we brought. Was Ravin, when he said halacha is like Rabbi Shizuri, referring to the Sofer, that Rabbi Shimon Shizuri says the full name needs to be suspended and not just part of the name. The problem is, if you recall, there was a machlokes amoraim about how to paskin in this machlokes tanaim, and Ravin was not quoted there, and therefore we cannot be referring to this case. The next attempt was the case of the ben pakua, the calf that was removed while alive when you shechted its mother, where the halacha is, according to Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, that this calf, even when it grows to 5 years old, does not require shchita. It can die in other ways, and the meat is still kosher. And there's no gezerah d'Rabbanan even. Now, the reason why Ravin can't be referring to this case is because Ze'iri already reported Rabbi Chanina that we pasking like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri there, and we would have quoted Ravin together with Ze'iri. The next attempt was the case of a dying husband. The husband is sick, and he says, write to get to my wife. He does not say, go and give it to her as well. Many people write a get without giving it. The question is, are we allowed to now give it to her as well, even though he only said to write it? So Rabbi Shimon Shizuri says, you can give it to her. So maybe we're referring to this case. We're not referring to this case because Rabbi Yochanan already ruled like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri there, and Ravin was not mentioned. Our next attempt was the case of Demai. Demai is produce from an Am Haaretz who sold it to you, and we cannot rely that he tithed it to Trumat Masrot as he is meant to. Now, Rabbi Shimon Shizuri has a radical opinion there, that let's say you take Trumat Maser, so you take the certain tithes and from this demai, and then they fall back into the original produce. And now you have this mixture now of Trumat Maser, which goes to the Kohen, and the rest of the produce, can you eat it? In a case where it's not demai, you're not allowed to eat it because the ratio has to be 100-1 of bittul. Here, though, Rabbi Shimon Shizuri says, because it's demai, you can go to the seller, and if the seller says, trust me, I tithed it, because majority of Amei Haaretz do take tithes, you can trust him in this case and eat the whole mixture. But then the Gemara said Ravin can't be referring to this case because Rabbi Yochanan said there we paskin like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, and Ravin was not mentioned. Then the final case we presented today that was also pushed off was a case of Egyptian beans, Pol HaMitzri, and in that case the beans took root across 2 years, before and after Rosh Hashanah. And the halacha is that the year for Truma and Maser is defined by when the beans took root. So now you have some that took root before Rosh Hashanah, some that took root after Rosh Hashanah. You don't know which ones were when because it's a whole mixture in the same farm. So Rabbi Shimon Shizuri says, no problem, mix them all together, take tithes from the mixture, and we assume the stuff that you took out for last year is for your tithing for last year, and the stuff that you took for this year is for this year. But then we also said there that Rabbi Yochanan was quoted already ruling that like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri there, and Ravin was not mentioned. So we leave today with this cliffhanger. what was Ravin referring to when he said, we paskin like Rabbi Shimon Chazuri, and we'll leave that answer for tomorrow.